All right, welcome to the screencast on bone. Let's just dive right in. So the first thing we want to do, we're on to another system, is put the system in the context of whole body homeostasis. So there's only one slide here, but there's a lot of important information. Support, protection, movement, those pretty much just speak for themselves. So if you're thinking support, think your vertebral column helps you stand upright. Protection, your skull, your ribs, protect some of your internal organs. Movement, right? Your movements would not be what they are if you didn't have your skeleton for your muscles to pull on. So your skeleton acts as the levers that your muscles move around to generate movement. And then this other stuff that is not so obvious when we think about the skeleton, there is a lot of calcium that is in bone matrix, and your body needs proper amounts of calcium in the bloodstream in order for electrophysiology to work properly. So your body uses your bone matrix as a reservoir for calcium. So it's not just that your bones need calcium, but your body needs calcium, and your bones can store it or act as a source of calcium when you're not getting enough in your diet. Your skeleton or your bones are also where all of your blood cells are made. This is called hematopoiesis. It takes place in the red marrow. I forget where I got this picture. I'm assuming it came from the regular book, but it's a cut through of the head of a femur, and you can see here is all the red marrow, red in color, and then here where they've cut a little bit deeper, they're getting down into the very top of the medullary cavity where the yellow marrow is, and you can see it is actually yellow. So the red part in the spongy bone is for blood cell formation, red blood cells and white blood cells, and then the yellow marrow in your medullary cavity serves as triglyceride storage or fat storage. Before we get into bone, we do want to introduce three different types of cartilage. These were not in chapter 4 when we did the tissues, because I didn't want to do all of the tissues out of context of the organs in which you find them. So there is a lot of cartilage in your skeletal system, so we included it here in the skeletal system. So you do want to remember they're connective tissues, so it's going to be cells suspended in an extracellular matrix. For all three of the different types of cartilage we have, the cell is the same kind of cell. It's a chondrocyte. And then what's different is the nature of the extracellular matrix. Is it hard? Is it flexible? What kind of fibers are in it? So starting up first is hyaline cartilage. And we're not going to worry so much about the chemical ingredients of the matrix as we want to understand its physical properties. So it is a hard and smooth matrix with collagen fibers in it, although you generally don't see them. They are there to reinforce it and make sure that it doesn't crack. They give it a little bit of extra strength. You want to think of it like the outside of a football helmet or a motorcycle helmet. It is not really all that flexible, but smooth and shiny. So because it is smooth, it shows up on the ends of many of your long bones, where its job is to reduce friction. So like the head of your humerus fits into your shoulder socket, both of those surfaces, your humerus and your shoulder socket, are covered by hyaline cartilage. So you have this smooth, hard cartilage rubbing up against smooth, hard cartilage, and then there's less friction. It also is there to protect the ends of your bones because it is a little bit more flexible than bone tissue. When cartilage slams up against cartilage, it gives a little bit. When bone slams up against bone, things tend to break, like smashing rocks together. And right, it can also just provide physical support and act like a glue. So the cartilages in your rib cage attach ribs to your sternum, acting as both sort of glue and support. and you've also got a fair amount of hyaline cartilage in your nose, trachea, and larynx, stiffening and supporting those structures. So it shows up in a lot of different places, but you want to know the basic description, the functions, and places where you would find it. Elastic cartilage, this is a little bit easier because it doesn't show up in as many places. It looks similar to hyaline cartilage, so if we go back, I forgot to describe things, right? Each one of these little dark things is a chondrocyte. And the darkest part there is the nucleus, and then there looks like a little bit of schmutz around the nucleus. That's the cytoplasm. Everything that's this light-colored purple here, that is the matrix, which is a protein carbohydrate glue with collagen fibers running through it. We won't get into the chemical composition of the matrix. But then, so yeah, each one of those is a chondrocyte. The little holes that they live in are called lacuna. So there's a lacuna, but we didn't get the chondrocyte in the slide, and one there and one there. So that's the basic structure, chondrocytes in lacuna. When you get to elastic tissue, the lacuna are a little bit bigger, and you can still see there's a chondrocyte, there's a chondrocyte, there's a chondrocyte. The big difference now is that the matrix stains much darker, because the stains we use for connective tissue stain elastic tissue very dark, purple to almost black. So all of this stuff here that looks kind of like spider webby, those are the elastic fibers that are indicative of elastic cartilage. So its structural properties are that it's just very flexible. It can be bent and returned to its normal shape. And so you find it in certain parts of your earlobe. So the parts of the earlobe that are really flexible are elastic cartilage. The parts that are a little bit stiffer have a little bit of hyaline cartilage in them. And then your epiglottis, if you're not familiar with that, that is a little flap that closes over your airway or your larynx when you swallow, so that water and food go down into your esophagus and not into your trachea. So because that has to flop down and pop back up every time you swallow, it is made out of elastic cartilage. Then you have fibrocartilage. We are going to be looking at these in lab. This is the one that is I think the hardest to visually decipher. And when you look at the slides of it, depending on where you are in that particular chunk of cartilage, it takes on different appearances. Because basically it's glued to sometimes bone and sometimes hyaline cartilage, and it's hard to tell where one tissue ends and another tissue begins. But what you want to notice first when you're looking at fibrocartilage is all of these squiggly lines that you can kind of make out. It almost looks like dense regular connective tissue, only it's not quite as dense. It's got a little bit wavier of a texture to it. And then you've got chondrocyte, chondrocyte, chondrocytes. So you've got that same cell inside of a cavity structure that were in the other two kinds of cartilage. So the collagen fibers combined with whatever squishy protein carbohydrate glue they're embedded in makes it tough and flexible. So it's like a very tough, flexible rubber almost, and your body uses it as a shock absorber. The places where it shows up are your intervertebral discs, which you should remember from this week in lab, the pubic symphysis, which is going to be 2 weeks from now in lab. That's a little pad of fibrocartilage in between the two pubic bones that form the front of your pelvis or pelvic girdle, and it acts like a shock absorber, absorbing shock that's coming up from your legs. And then also you have a pad of fibrocartilage in your knee called the meniscus, which is there as a shock absorber. Additionally, it helps stabilize that joint. but primarily we're going to think of it as a shock absorber. So know those three cartilages, their basic description, and where you find them in the body. Then we're going to run through some bone markings really quick. I don't want to spend too much time on this because there aren't a ton of questions about these on the exam because they're very vague and a little bit silly, I want to say. I don't like that. I think we could have done away with some of the markings and have fewer markings. Like there's no reason to have both a tuberosity and a tubercle. But so as this says here, a tuberosity is supposed to be a large rounded projection. Let's see, where is it? There is this round part right here on the back of this is the ischial bone of your pelvic girdle. That is called the ischial tuberosity. And then you have a deltoid tuberosity. This one is not quite so thick and rounded. It's just sort of a raised rough surface where muscles attach. And then a tubercle is supposed to be a little bit smaller. So here you have the greater and lesser tubercle on the head of your humerus. A crest is relatively simple to see. It's just a large, prominent ridge that runs along the surface of a bone. So this is the iliac crest, because it is the crest on the top of your iliac bone, or the ilium. Moving right along, epicondyles. I should have done condyles first. A condyle is an articular surface. Usually rounded, can be concave or convex. An epicondyle is just superior to a condyle. So if we look down here, this is your elbow joint, this would be your humerus here, and your ulna. These surfaces right here, labeled trochlea and capitulum, are technically two different condyles, and then just above them, sort of like caps on either side, are your medial and lateral epicondyle. So you're going to have the same thing in the knee. The two big swellings on either side above your knee are going to be the medial and lateral epicondyle. Spines just stick straight out, so they, unlike a crest, they protrude further from the bone and are generally a little bit pointier and longer than a crest. Let's see. Head, I'm not going to worry about head, who cares? Facet, this we kind of want to understand. This is generally a small, relatively flat articular surface. This right here is a facet on the, as it says here, superior articular surface of this vertebrae here, which looks to me like a thoracic vertebrae, right, because it's got that long spinous process, which you could also just call a spine. Condyle, that we should have done first. So here on the bottom of your femur are two rounded articular surfaces, or two rounded surfaces where two bones are going to rub up against one another or articulate. That is a condyle. Technically speaking, the depressions, or so these would be convex. The concave surfaces on the top of the tibia that they fit into are also referred to as condyles. So a condyle can be either outwardly convex or inwardly concave. Let's see. So a meatus is a hole in a very thick bone. So it looks like a tube or a hallway. So it's a long canal through a thick bone. A foramen is generally about the same diameter in terms of how big of an opening it is. It's a round opening through a bone, but in the case of a foramen, the bone is usually flatter, so it's more like a doorway as opposed to a hallway. And then a fissure basically looks like a laceration. So this would be a fissure right here, that would be a fissure right there. That's a foramen, that's a foramen, because all of the bones in your skull are relatively thin. For the meatus, we can look here. So this is your temporal bone, which is actually kind of wide. So this hole right here goes from the inside of the temporal bone to the outside of the temporal bone, and probably runs like from about here to there. So it's a longer tube-like hole in the bone. Then you have, oh, by the way, I have modified the slides a little bit to make them work a little better. I took, what did I do? I took sinus and fissure off of this slide and took the stuff that was above it on this slide just to make it make more sense. Sorry, I just can't stop messing with my PowerPoints because they're never going to be perfect. Sinus, here, this is a sinus. So if you look, this is all bone all the way around. So this is a little air pocket inside of the sphenoid bone, and here's a little air pocket here inside of your frontal bone. Those are sinuses. That's where your sinus headaches come from. If you get a cold and you get some inflammation in there, it fills with fluid, and you get pressure and it doesn't feel good. A fossa, as this says, is a basin-like depression. So this depression right here that your brain sits in would be a fossa. There's kind of another one here formed by the temporal and sphenoid bones, and then another fossa right here that the front of your brain sits in. So those are those. Just review those definitions. There will be a couple questions on them on the exam, but I'll try not to make them too tricky. Because, you know, some of them are just silly, like the difference between a tubercle and a tuberosity, I just don't get. And then, where's my least favorite? This is my least favorite here, the trochanter, which really should just be called a tuberosity, because it's the same thing, no, or tubercle, because it's the same thing that's on the humerus. These are analogous bones, but they call those the trochanters for some reason, because anatomists were not systematic back in the day. All right, sorry. Then we get into bone matrix. So we touched on this a little bit in lab. We'll go into a little bit more detail here, but this should reinforce the video that you're watching in lab. So instead of dividing our matrix between what's the ground substance and what's the protein fiber, we're dividing it between what's inorganic and what's organic, because that is how the physical properties segregate themselves or align themselves. So your matrix has a lot of minerals in it. Minerals are calcium phosphate and hydroxyapatite, these other minerals, which are largely free of carbon, although there is some carbon in the calcium carbonate. We refer to that portion with the calcium in it as the inorganic portion of your matrix. So calcium you basically want to think of as like sand, and sand is hard, it resists compression. So this is the part of your bone matrix that makes it hard. Then you have to glue all of your sand together, right? Because sand by itself doesn't support a lot of weight. You need something to bind it. That's where the organic portion of bone matrix comes in. So there's two parts to the organic portion. There's this really complicated protein and carbohydrate glue, which I'm not going to go into the, what's the word I'm looking for? The details of, but it's glycoproteins and proteoglycans, which contains things like glycosylated aminoglycans, and all this other stuff. And then some collagen fibers. So basically the collagen is this yellow, that is pure protein, and then the glycoproteins have a bunch of different kinds of molecules in them. They're all a little bit shorter, and they kind of act like the glue that holds it all together. So between the glycoproteins and the collagen, this acts as what binds the matrix together, and the collagen gives it some flexibility and also added strength, because the collagen fibers are very long and they run throughout the matrix so that stress is then felt throughout the matrix. All right, so where are we next? And the other thing I will say, there's another word I want to throw in here, sorry, and that is tensile strength. I think it comes up every now and then. So that's part of the binding part. This is like you can pull on bone, which your muscles do, and the bone doesn't fall apart because it's all glued together. So that tensile strength combined with the flexibility means you can put lots of different lateral pressures on bones, not just stacking weights on top of them, but also trying to get them to bend. And they don't bend or break very easily because all of the hard calcium is glued together by this stiff but flexible matrix. Then we have what cells show up in bones. We're going to have 4 different cell types, starting with, four, sorry. Osteogenic cells. Where are they? There's your osteogenic cells. So this is a stem cell, which means it is going to be able to go through mitosis and produce more osteoblasts. So that's what the osteogenic cells produce. And the osteoblasts are what form bone. So they secrete the matrix. All of this stuff here is secreted by an osteoblast. I think that's a picture I'm supposed to delete. Then you get to osteocytes. They just sit there in the bone. So this is just an osteocyte all by itself in a microscopic image of ground compact bone. Each one of these black-looking little spider, hairy centipede-looking things is an osteocyte that's embedded in the matrix. It is thought that what they do is communicate information about stress so that bones can be remodeled on the outside and on the inside in response to stress. And we'll go over later how the remodeling works. So your osteoblasts are going to build bone. Your osteocytes are going to sit there and communicate. And then your osteoclasts break down bone, or I say cleave. So blasts build, sites sit, clasts cleave, just so you can remember all this stuff. And what they do is they dump acid on the bone to dissolve the mineral part of the matrix, and then use enzymes to dissolve the ground substance, protein fibers, and proteoglycan goop, and dissolve the bone. So they do this when bone needs to be remodeled, and when your blood calcium levels are low. If you need to steal some calcium from your bone, it's your osteoclasts that do it. There are membranes in your bones. These we'll cover really quick. So on the outside of the bone, you want to think perimeter is the periosteum. It's a layer of fibrous tissue with cells, nerves, and blood vessels underneath. So you have your blasts and your clasts and your osteogenic cells there so that the bone can be remodeled, or if it breaks, new bone tissue can be generated. On the inside of the cell lining the medullary cavity would be the endosteum, and there's also going to be osteoblasts and osteoclasts on the inside of the bone to remodel the bone on the inside. Let's see, what else do we want to know? You want to remember where the red marrow is. It is in the spongy bone. You find spongy bone in the heads of your long bones, like your femur and humerus, and then also in the inner portion of your flat bones, which is called diploe. Why it's got that little umlaut? I think it comes from French. One of my students said that once, and I'm not really sure, but we're going to say that's French umlaut, not German. All right, and this part down here we don't really care about, so we're just going to skip over it because I don't ask questions about it. Oh, whoops, I'm stuck in there. There we go. But we do want to be familiar with two different types of bone formation or ossification. So these are two different methods for building bones. Intramembranous ossification is the first one. It's this neat little four-step process here where you start with mesenchyme, which is flat, kind of like a membrane. So these are sometimes called membrane bones. And then that mesenchyme is ossified or is turned into bony tissue. So here you've got all mesenchyme, and then some developmental cue hits these mesenchymal cells or mesenchymal cells and tells them that they are going to develop into osteoblasts. The osteoblasts start secreting osteoid. Those osteoblasts that get trapped in the osteoid become osteocytes. And then the formation of the osteoid itself causes the mesenchyme around it to start making a periosteum. And then, I think then you go here next. So we go from here to there to there. Now you've got your periosteum. Blood vessels start to invade, so you're going to have your bone marrow. And you get the further development of spongy bone. And then at the end, you get a collar of compact bone laid down by the osteoblasts trapped underneath the periosteum. And that completes the formation of your membrane bone. Then with endochondral ossification, this is actually a more complicated process, and I have decided that it is not worth going into all the 5 or 6 steps that constitute it, so you just need to know the basics. So for endochondral ossification, you start with a piece of hyaline cartilage, roughly in the shape of a long bone, and then that cartilage is going to keep growing, but as it grows, it is replaced by bony tissue. So it starts here in what is going to be the diaphysis. Some of the cartilage cells there in the middle die off. A blood vessel is going to burrow its way into the shaft, and that is going to deliver osteoblasts to the inside of this bone, so you can start laying down osteoid and calcify the inside of what is going to be the medullary cavity. At the same time, osteoblasts are laying down matrix on the outside of this cartilage template and ossifying the outside of what is going to be the diaphysis or the shaft. And then towards the end, you get blood vessels invading the two epiphyses, and they start, or I should say the cartilage in the epiphysis is going to degrade and die. That generates a little cavity where osteoblasts are deposited by these invading blood vessels, and then the epiphysis is ossified or turned into bony tissue by the osteoblasts. And this is where all of your long bones come from. So arms, legs, fingers all come from endochondral ossification. Most of the bones of your skull come from intramembranous ossification. And I forget about your vertebrae. Some of the irregular bones, I forget where they come from. Then, postnatally, your bones have to grow. And they can grow in 2 ways. First is interstitial growth. This is growth at the ends of long bones, so this makes your long bones longer. It takes place at what is called the epiphyseal plate, which you'll see in the next slide, and continues as long as your cartilage cells are dividing. Then you have appositional growth. This usually takes place on the outside of the bone, just deep to the periosteum, that membrane that covers the bone. And here, osteoblasts are just laying down new layers of bone matrix onto existing bone to make the bone thicker. I have added a little bit of detail here, so you might want to write this stuff down. It's not hugely important, but I did think I should beef up this slide a little bit. So this is the interstitial growth or longitudinal growth that takes place in your long bones. So if we go back here and we just look really quick at endochondral ossification, you start with all cartilage. When you're done, you have a bony diaphysis, some bone in the epiphysis, but there's still a layer of cartilage in between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. Excuse me. That is called the epiphyseal plate. As long as you are still growing, your epiphyseal plate here, if we blow it up, it looks like this, is still undergoing mitosis. So this layer right here would be the very top, and these cells are not doing anything. They are just cartilage. These chondrocytes here are proliferating. They're undergoing mitosis, causing the cartilage to grow. So you want to envision the cartilage kind of growing in this direction towards the top of the slide. And then as you move down, these are the older cells because they're born up here and then they get pushed down. So as they're growing, they're secreting parts of what is going to become the bone matrix. Then they die, and basically when all of them die, they leave cavities in the bone and a loosely organized matrix that then osteoblasts that arrive with the blood vessels can add the osteoid to and fully ossify or harden this tissue. So you're going to have dying off cartilage that leaves a little bit of an empty cavity with some soup in it, that your osteoblasts are going to turn into bone. So the cartilage is kind of moving in this direction, and as the cartilage grows, it keeps on getting replaced by bone. So as long as you have dividing cartilage, the bone is going to keep growing. Once these cells here stop dividing, this process here is going to continue, and this wave of ossification is going to continue all the way up until all of the cartilage in the epiphyseal plate is gone and you're just left with what's called the epiphyseal line. So the growth of cartilage and therefore the growth of bone is primarily under the control of growth hormone. So this is what is stimulating your cartilage to undergo mitosis, allowing for bone growth. During puberty, I should say, your sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen, also increase in levels, as does growth hormone. And it's the increase in testosterone and estrogen along with growth hormone that promote the adolescent growth spurts, and then a decline in growth hormone along with that burst of sex hormones is what causes the chondrocytes to stop dividing, and then you know you're done growing because there's no cartilage left in your long bones. So also we want to know, as bones are growing, they are being remodeled. This is happening continuously. It's kind of hard to put into words how the head and the shaft of the bone are being remodeled, but I can try and draw it. So if we just took this same bone here, and this is where the growth is taking place. If we just made this part longer, it would look kind of like that, and then there'd be the taper, You've got this taper here, a little bit, and then taper. So this taper right here has to be continuously put back into the bone. So as the epiphyseal plate, which is about yay wide, keeps growing, this part has to be eaten away and eaten away and eaten away like that, so that the shaft continues straight and you only taper when you get to the top. So it would look something like that. So this part has to be eaten away and remodeled as the bone grows longer. I don't know how to ask questions about that, but it's something you should know. As the bones get longer, they also get wider on the outside. They get thicker because they're heavier, and then you need stronger bones to hold up the bones that are above them. So the way it works is that you get new bone being laid down on the outside, but at the same time your osteoclasts are eating away at the inside. So the wall of your diaphysis is getting thicker, but at the same time your medullary cavity is getting wider. And the way it works is that the osteoblasts on the outside work a little bit faster than the osteoclasts on the inside, so that the thickness of the diaphysis wall increases as the bone gets bigger, and this makes it stronger. And your body is always playing a balancing act between trying to get your skeleton light and efficient without losing weight. So it's always sort of remodeling, where do bones need to be thicker, where can they be thinner if there isn't a lot of stress, so that you're minimizing the amount of weight that you have to carry around without compromising the structural integrity of your skeleton. If anybody is into cycling, right, it's a lot like bike design, making bike frames that are as light as possible, but also strong where they need to be. For this slide, just know that these things here are part of a healthy diet if you want to have healthy bones, and that's all we care about. And then we'll move on. Wolff's Law. So I am not going to ask you about Wolff, but I will ask you about the law. And what it says is that a bone remodels in response to force or demands put on it. What it means is that wherever stress is applied to a bone, the bone will become thicker. So the arm, if you're right-handed, you're going to use your right arm more, and it's probably also going to be stronger, which means you're going to put more stress on those bones in your right arm. So you will have a higher bone density in your right arm than your left arm. For long curved bones, they tend to have a thicker wall in the middle where the stress would be. So think, if you apply pressure to either end of a stick, like you've got a stick like this, right, and you apply pressure, that's not a very good picture, but right, you apply pressure on either end and make it buckle, it's most likely to snap right there in the middle. So it's the middle of your long bones that are the thickest, and I don't know that I have a good picture to show that. Well, let me just look here, right? So you can't see here on this the medullary cavity, but you want to imagine that up here near the top, the medullary cavity might be relatively wide, and I'm not doing a good job of it. But then down here in the middle, the medullary cavity is going to be very thin. And again, this is a crappy job I'm doing, I know. But again, so near the top, the bones are more hollowed out, and in the middle, even though it doesn't look wider here in the middle, the shaft is thicker because the medullary cavity is thinner. That reinforces the parts of the long bones that endure the most stress. And again, it's the osteocytes that we think communicate that information about stress and direct where bones can be thinner and where bones can be thicker. Oh, and also last thing just to point out, right? This is why all of those tuberosities and tubercles that we were talking about exist, because those are all either muscle or ligament attachment points that puts stress on the bone, and the bones then grow thicker in response to that stress. Then we have what is called hormonal control of blood calcium levels. What you need to remember here is that blood calcium levels are controlled to benefit your whole body physiology. We cover them during the skeleton chapter because they affect the skeleton, but you're your body doesn't regulate calcium levels so that you have proper bone density. It's regulating blood calcium levels so that you have enough calcium in your bloodstream, and it just happens to affect bone density. So there are two hormones that control blood calcium levels. Parathyroid hormone is released in response to low blood calcium levels. So it is going to stimulate the osteoclasts that are going to dissolve bone, release the calcium into the bloodstream, and your blood calcium levels will get higher. So if you're not getting enough calcium in your diet, parathyroid hormone is going to scavenge it from your skeleton, even if it means that you're compromising the bone density in your skeleton and risking breaking a hip or something. If your blood calcium levels are too low, that will kill you quicker than a weak skeleton. Whoops. And then calcitonin, just the opposite. If your blood calcium levels are too high and you need to tone it down a little, that's what calcitonin does, is cause your osteoblasts to then secrete more matrix or more calcium into your bone matrix and bring your blood calcium levels down. It says here that the effects are negligible. I am assuming that calcitonin is not super important because most of the time, most people do not have to worry about elevated blood calcium levels, because calcium is one of those things that some of us don't get enough of in our diet. So it's generally not a problem if we don't have a good response to high blood calcium, but it's definitely a problem if we don't have a good response to low blood calcium levels. And this is why parathyroid hormone is seen as more important than calcitonin. Then fracture repair. You just want to commit this list to memory. I can envision some sort of question on the exam like, which of the following is the proper order of steps in fracture repair? So if you break a bone, you're going to split a lot of blood vessels, so you're going to get big blood swelling or hematoma. That is going to be followed by what is called the formation of a fibrocartilaginous callus. So this is fibrocartilage that just kind of glues the bones together temporarily until spongy bone can be formed. And then that is what is called the spongy callus sometimes, or bony callus, I should say. And it tends to still be pretty much thicker than the original bone itself. Then this spongy bone is remodeled to become compact bone, and you get new compact bone there. And you can sometimes still see where the bony callus was, like thickenings in the bone post-fracture. That shows up on x-rays years later. So that's it, 43 minutes for bone. Thanks for listening.